By the time the first photographs hit the screens, the mountain already looked wrong. Not shattered, not split open, just punctured. 6 fresh wounds across a dark slope above one of the most protected nuclear sites on Earth. Ash spread across the ridgeline. Tunnel country turned into impact country. For years, Iran had treated depth like a guarantee. Bury the program far enough down, harden it enough, hide it inside rock, and eventually every threat in the sky starts to sound theoretical. The irony is that Washington had spent much of the same era solving exactly that problem: how to turn burial itself into a target. That night, the bunker was not the answer. It was the question. Again. Fordow had always been more than a facility. It was a proposition. Built deep inside a mountain near Qom and publicly exposed in 2009 after years of covert work, it represented a specific Iranian wager: that some parts of the nuclear program could be made so difficult to reach and so politically costly to attack that they would survive any first wave and shape every negotiation after that. When Barack Obama stood with Nicolas Sarkozy and Gordon Brown to reveal the site, he said, "The size and configuration of this facility is inconsistent with a peaceful program." That line mattered because it stripped away the polite fiction early. Fordow was not alarming simply because it enriched uranium. It was alarming because of where and how it was built. Iran answered with its own logic. Tehran said the reason for building underground was straightforward. It faced repeated threats of attack, and hardened protection was the only rational response. In other words, one side saw concealment as evidence of intent. The other saw it as insurance against vulnerability. That argument never really ended. It just moved from conference tables into architecture. The stakes rose and fell over the years. Under the 2015 nuclear deal, Fordow was constrained and partially repurposed under international monitoring. Then the deal frayed, then effectively broke, and the site drifted back toward the center of global concern. By June 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency was warning that inspectors needed to get back in and account for more than 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. That number hung over everything because it meant the debate was no longer abstract. Fordow was not just a symbol of defiance. It was tied to real material, real timelines, and real fear about what survivable enrichment capacity might mean if diplomacy failed completely. Then on June 13th, Israel opened a new phase of the crisis with direct strikes on Iran. That pushed the old Fordow problem into the open again. Above-ground facilities could be hit, air defenses could be probed, scientists could be scattered, infrastructure could be burned. But Fordow sat beneath its mountain like an argument nobody had fully settled. The world knew where the problem was. The question was whether anyone could actually finish it from the air. Washington had been thinking about that question for a very long time. This is the part that gets flattened in the public imagination. People hear bunker buster and picture a single weapon, a single aircraft, a single night. In reality, the American answer was an institutional obsession stretched across decades. Engineers, weapons labs, stealth planners, test ranges, bomber crews, targeting specialists, tanker choreography, and policymakers all orbiting the same strategic fact that buried facilities change political calculations unless someone can credibly threaten them anyway. The Air Force later described the requirement in dry, bureaucratic language: a long-standing need to reach and destroy hard and deeply buried facilities. The development trail tells the real story. Early testing on the Massive Ordnance Penetrator began in 2004 under the Defense Threat Reduction Agency with Air Force Research Laboratory support. The program transitioned to the Air Force in 2010 as a quick reaction capability. Aircraft integration work had already been underway by 2009. That means the weapon that entered the headlines in June 2025 was not a panic invention. It was the product of more than 20 years of refusing to let underground protection become strategic immunity. And everyone understood the real purpose, whether they admitted it publicly or not. This was never just about one Iranian site. It was about erasing the assumption that a state could bury its most sensitive capabilities deeply enough to place them beyond decision. Fordow simply became the purest test case. If that mountain could be made vulnerable, every planner in every capital would get the message. There is something almost monastic about these kinds of military projects. They exist in the background for years, expensive and abstract, while presidents come and go and news cycles move on. Then one day, the thing that had mostly lived in classified slides is called into the real world. Pete Hegseth would later say, the June 2025 strike marked the first operational employment of the MOP. That phrase sounds technical. It is not. It is the sound of a capability leaving theory. The reason older tools fell short was not mysterious. Conventional precision strikes can destroy entrances, power supplies, ventilation, surface buildings, nearby support infrastructure. They can make an underground site harder to run, harder to access, harder to hide. They do not necessarily guarantee the buried core is finished, and that distinction matters because a site like Fordow was designed around exactly that gap. Its value was not just what it contained. Its value was that it forced an attacker to prove more than reach. It had to prove certainty. That is why the solution was never a bomb alone. It was a pairing. A stealth bomber built to survive sophisticated air defense environments. A 30,000-pound class penetrator built for protected targets. Mission planning capable of carrying that package across intercontinental distance with repeated refuelings, layered deception, and tight timing. Above all, patience. You do not build this kind of capability quickly because there are too many trade-offs to solve at once. Weight versus platform, survivability versus payload, secrecy versus readiness, technical feasibility versus political willingness to ever use it. And even then, the American answer had limits. It was not a magic key. It did not promise omniscience underground. It did not guarantee you would know, in the first hours after impact, exactly what had been destroyed, exactly what had been moved, exactly what might still be recoverable. What it offered was something colder, the ability to attack a sanctuary that was supposed to change your behavior. That is the equation Washington spent years solving, not invulnerability, decision. When the operation finally came, it came under a name designed to sound blunt and metallic, Operation Midnight Hammer. On the evening of June 21st, 2025, from the American side of the clock, early June 22nd in Iran, the United States launched the largest B-2 operational strike in its history. According to General Dan Kane, more than 125 American aircraft took part. 7 B-2 Spirit bombers flew east from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri on an 18-hour approach that required multiple aerial refuelings. Another group flew west over the Pacific as decoys, helping seed the public picture with the wrong flight path at the wrong moment. That mattered. Surprise was not decorative here. It was structural. It preserved the bomber package long enough to reach the moment where the rest of the plan could work. At about 5 p.m. Eastern Time, just before the strike aircraft entered Iranian airspace, a U.S. submarine launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Isfahan. That move did two things at once. It widened the geometry of the attack and made the night harder to read from the Iranian side. As the bombers pressed inward, U.S. fighters and support aircraft moved ahead of them, checking for enemy aircraft and surface-to-air threats, while deception measures kept layering over the picture. Then the timing tightened. At about 6:40 p.m. Eastern, which was about 2:10 in the morning in Iran, the lead B-2 dropped the first two Massive Ordnance Penetrators on Fordow. Over the next 25 minutes, a total of 14 MOPs were delivered against Fordow and Natanz, while the Tomahawks struck Isfahan after bombs had already begun falling elsewhere. Kane later said around 75 precision-guided weapons were used in all. Notice what the sequence reveals. First, the submarine widened the attack and forced attention outward, which helped preserve confusion. That helped the bomber stream arrive with surprise intact. That allowed the penetrators to be delivered before Iranian defenses could meaningfully respond, which meant the operation's central idea, that sanctuary could be struck before it could react, survived contact with reality. Iran's last-minute countermove was not really in the sky. It was underground, administrative, and anticipatory. Before the American strikes, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had informed the IAEA that Iran would adopt special measures to protect nuclear equipment and materials. Later reporting suggested some enriched uranium may have been moved ahead of the attack. That is important because it means Tehran was not waiting passively for impact. It was already trying to complicate what success would even mean. But that did not cancel the American plan. It just changed the metric. The raid was not built around one cinematic reveal in which a camera opens on a glowing chamber and declares the whole problem solved forever. It was built to hit the protected system itself. Enrichment sites, buried access, connected infrastructure, the assumption of sanctuary. That is why later assessments focus not only on Fordow's craters, but also on impacted tunnel entrances at Isfahan and fresh strikes on Natanz, where ground-penetrating munitions were also used. The message was broader than one chamber under one mountain. It was that the network protecting the program could be forced open from multiple directions at once. And the most chilling line of the night may have been the simplest. Iran's fighters did not fly, and it appears that Iran's surface-to-air missile systems did not see us, Kane said. Throughout the mission, we retained the element of surprise. That sentence is the whole operation in miniature, not just power, preparation. The aftermath was where certainty went to die. Officially, the American story was immediate and absolute. Donald Trump called the sites completely and totally obliterated. Kane said initial battle damage assessments showed extremely severe damage and destruction at all three sites. The White House and Pentagon treated that formulation not as interpretation, but as conclusion. Politically, that made sense. If you commit the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. history, using a capability designed over decades for a target like Fordow, there is enormous pressure to describe the outcome in maximal terms. But almost at once, a second narrative began pushing back. Rafael Grossi, the IAEA chief, offered the line that became the credibility anchor for every serious discussion that followed. At this time, no one, including the IAEA, is in a position to have fully assessed the underground damage at Fordow. He added that very significant damage was expected given the payload used and the vibration-sensitive nature of centrifuges. Expected, not proven. That distinction mattered. Then came the leak. Early U.S. intelligence reporting, described by ABC News and others as a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, suggested the strikes may have set Iran's nuclear program back by only a few months. According to those reports, the bombing may have sealed entrances and wrecked above-ground structures while leaving some lower sections intact. Some enriched uranium, the report said, may have been moved beforehand. The assessment itself reportedly carried a warning label. Full battle damage analysis would take days to weeks and had not yet been coordinated across the wider intelligence community. That is not a trivial caveat. It is a giant one. Because now the dispute was no longer between Washington and Tehran. It was between categories of knowledge, public political claim versus early classified estimate, surface imagery versus underground uncertainty, expected mechanical damage versus confirmed physical access. Grossi's demand for inspectors to return versus an environment in which verification itself had become part of the geopolitical struggle. Even later analyses did not cleanly close the gap. Some argued Fordow had almost certainly suffered severe internal damage simply from the scale of the blasts and the sensitivity of the machinery. Others pointed out that a damaged site is not the same thing as a permanently dead program, especially if stockpiles, expertise, and replacement pathways survive elsewhere. Isfahan raised its own questions. Natanz had already been hit hard before the U.S. raid, which complicated the accounting, and hanging over all of it was the unresolved issue of where exactly the enriched uranium stockpile was and what access inspectors would have to verify it. So the honest answer, even after the bombs, was narrower than either side wanted. The United States demonstrated that Fordow was not untouchable. It did not instantly produce a universally accepted measurement of what remained. That unresolved tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Because the durable lesson here has almost nothing to do with one administration or one country's talking points. It is this: fortification does not end strategic competition. It extends it. Build something deep enough, and your adversary will not necessarily give up. If the target matters enough, they will spend years changing the tools, the doctrine, the routes, the politics, and the patience required to reach it anyway. You can swap out the names, and the principle holds. It applies to North Korea's underground facilities, where burial is meant to preserve coercive power under constant surveillance. It applies to the tunnel logic used by non-state actors like Hezbollah, where protection and persistence matter as much as firepower. It applies to any major military that assumes hardened underground infrastructure can permanently offset an opponent's advantage in air power and intelligence. Bunkers shape timelines. They do not cancel them. Iran's wager at Fordow was never irrational. Depth bought years. It complicated diplomacy, raised military thresholds, and forced the United States to treat one mountain as a national security problem instead of a regional nuisance. That is real strategic value. But the American answer was equally real. If you turn survival into an engineering contest, a superpower may eventually decide to out-engineer you. And that is the coldest part of the whole episode. The mountain worked until it didn't. For years, Iran trusted stone to keep history outside. In June 2026, history came through the rock anyway.